Hello, it's Bruce here again. I'm about to add some ballast to the trackage that goes into my engine house, and because this engine house is on a logging railroad, they normally had dirt floors. Occasionally they would just go back later and add some wood around the periphery, but around the tracks it was still dirt. So when I ballast this, I'm actually not going to be using fancy rock ballast. It's going to be dirt, and I'll talk about that in a minute. What you see coming out, there's two tracks in this engine house. One goes all the way through, and that's the one you're looking at right now, and that's a dual gauge trackage with the outer two, the far one and this far one, being HO scale standard gauge, and this inner one and this one are HON3, which means a scale 3 feet between the rails. I'm going to remove the engine house. I'll show you the front, and that there are indeed two bays to the engine house. And you can see I do have wood floors around in between the tracks and then around the periphery of the building. Now I'm going to get rid of this building before I get ballast and glue and everything all over it. So the other track, the one that does not go all the way through the engine house, is just narrow gauge, HON3, and it stops about 4 or 5 feet before the end of the house. The end of the engine house is about here. Now normally when I ballast track, I don't worry about ballast going off to the sides, but here in this engine house, because there's a partial wood floor, I cannot allow big gobs of the ballast to end up underneath that wood, or it won't sit flat on the base. And so I've temporarily put a couple of styrene barriers here. Right now I'm just going to work on the narrow gauge portion here. Those are down temporarily. I have them held in place with a couple of small pieces of 3M's number 465 transfer tape. I've done a video on the use of this tape to put roofing material on, but I find it useful elsewhere as well. I should be able to get this tape up off the base, but if I don't, it's flat enough that when I glue the structure to the base, it will not get in the way. But I'll be able to easily remove these pieces of styrene later. The tools today are my standard ballasting tools, and sometime when I am actually ballasting track on the layout, I'll do a more in-depth video on ballasting. But this particular tool is a paint edger, and its use has taken ballasting from a job I dreaded to a job that I don't mind at all. This is unbelievably useful. It was a tip given to me by Tim Kirchhoff, who's a modeler from Indiana, and I will be forever in his debt. I also have a sponge paintbrush, which I have trimmed down to HON3 scale so that it fits just between the rails, and that'll be helpful. And after I pour the diluted white glue on it, if any pieces of the ballast pop up on top of the ties, then I go in with a very stiff, it's about a 1/4 inch wide flat paintbrush. Applying the ballast, you can use a plastic spoon, or in my case I have this little metal measuring spoon, and then a pipette. These plastic pipettes, I think Model Power sells them, just perfect for distributing the diluted white glue and an alcohol mix that I'll talk to you about. So that's basically the tools. So let's get about it. Oh, a word about the ballast. I think you can see here that in this coffee can it says dirt medium. Not so much out here in Michigan, but when I lived in New Jersey, any place I went in the backyard, if I took a shovel full of dirt and started let it dry out and then sifted it through a couple different size strainers, I would get loads of larger pebbles. Obviously out here not so much because everything is either sand or clay in Michigan, but in Jersey you get a load of larger pebbles. Eventually you come down to this medium one, which really is just a bunch of little pebbles, which make great ballast for this kind of application. So I'm going to use that. Next time I go back to Jersey to visit my sister, I'm going to have to stock up again. So I'm going to put, and I notice I'm loading it between the rails and not on the side of the rail so much. I'm not too worried because this should, well, I'll put a little in there. But normally it will flow over the rails when I use that paint edger. It'll push ahead of me whatever I don't use here anyway, right off the board. All right. So now this paint edger, which you can see is kind of the perfect width. I don't know if you can see it yet, and I'll zoom in a second, but right away now there is virtually no ballast on top of the ties, none. And that's the beauty of this, using this paint edger. It works great in HO scale. When you get up to O scale, you might have to run the edger the other way through, but still, just a fantastic way to get every bit of ballast off of the top of the ties. All right, let me there. That's still pretty clear. If I go any closer, I think it's not going to be clear. So that's it again. Let me just run this through over one more time, just to make sure that everything is off. Of course, this is almost all going to be inside the engine house anyway. Now I'm just going to take this up a minute and get this gravel. Since I'm using that coffee can as my holder, I'm going to put it into the lid. Until I get more, this stuff is precious. So there we go. Okay, so the ballast is applied here between the tracks, and the next step is to hold it down with a diluted white glue. Now, if I just started putting the diluted white glue on top of there, it would bubble and stay on top. It would just not penetrate and flow. So what you want to do, and over the years, people used to use something called wet water, which is water with a little bit of dish detergent in it. But I find that making a mixture of rubbing alcohol and water works as a much better way to get this wettened, so that when you put the glue down, the glue and mixture will go down to the bottom. The ratio I have here, first of all, you can use the cheap stuff. You can use the 70% because you really only need a very dilute mix. And even this now, what I did was I mixed it in this little jar, 3 parts water to 1 part isopropyl alcohol. So it's very dilute, as you can see. Now here's where you need a little patience, because I'm going to pick up some of that alcohol mix with my pipette, and I am not going to squirt it very hard. I'm going to dribble it on a tie, a couple drops at a time, and it will flow. If you squirt, you're going to disrupt all of that nice ballast work that you already did. Now I can see the water spreading into all the ballast. You want it all wet. Now, quite frankly, when I'm doing this without somebody looking over my shoulders, I do go a little bit faster, and I do get some ballast up that I have to clean up later, but trying to show how nicely this works. Because if you're doing a layout where you're doing many feet of track, you're going to probably lose patience doing this like this. But I got to tell you that this is kind of crucial that I don't mess this up, because the engine house has to sit back on top of this base. Now I don't mind if this leaks out underneath the styrene barriers that I put in, because even if it stains the base, it's going to be covered by the engine house. As you go along, since a lot of this is creeping in front of me, I can actually speed the process up a little bit. And the nice thing about this Jersey medium dirt, as I have it labeled, is since it really is all little pebbles, this is not making a mud pie. Lots of parts of the country have this kind of dirt. I had picked some up when my son lived in the hill country of Texas, and it worked just as well. Just not so much where I live right now. However, if you want sand, this is the place to be. Okay. I'll put that back in, and before I spill it, put the lid on, and I'll zoom in so you can see what that looks like now that it's wet. And again, all it's wet with is the alcohol and water mix. Okay? Now comes the last step, which is to apply the diluted white glue, and this is regular Elmer's white glue, and I try to get it about the consistency of milk, and it's about 1 part Elmer's regular Elmer's white glue and 3 parts water. But you can play with it a little bit. You want it to be like milk. And now I'm going to do the exact same thing I just did, dropping it on top of the ties, watching it flow, and it flows so much easier now because the fact that we have that alcohol mixed down, which is allowing everything to flow right through. Now, different ballast materials, when you're working on your actual track work, behaves a little bit differently. If you buy the real granite, there are a couple companies that supply that, then it doesn't tend to float up, just like this is not floating up as I'm putting all this liquid down. If you used a Woodland Scenics, and that's kind of what I do, they used to, and I guess they still do, make it out of crushed walnut shells or some kind of shells, and sometimes those do float a little bit. If you're seeing bubbles right now, you'll notice that the bubbles have disappeared down here. So I don't worry too much about that. Nothing is ever visible when it's all done. And you can see the white glue kind of dissipating everywhere, and that's it. I will, as soon as the video is over, clean that out with just some warm water and help those bubbles go. And probably in a few minutes, after I'm done with the video and it sets a little bit, I'll probably lift these off to allow some of that liquid to get away from the ballast. Hopefully it will not drag a bunch of ballast with it. But that's it. Really no difference between ballasting this and doing what I do on my layout. This is the tool to get. A lot of different paint manufacturers. This is Sureline, but you can get them. Sometimes they're a little bit different shape, but you want the small edger, and that's about 1 inch across in the short direction. Lifesavers. Thank you, Tim, once again. Okay, that's it.